everyone, and welcome back to Neuropsychology. So we covered a lot so far. We talked about anatomical orientations and planes. We talked about the organization of the nervous system. We talked about support and protection, blood supply, and different brain cells and their origin. So today we are going to cover what brain matter consists of. So you have three types of brain matter: gray, white, and reticular matter. And then we're going to go over some terms. So we're going to go over what ventricles are and which ones we have. So what are they called? We're going to talk about nuclei, nerves, and tracts. And then lastly, we will talk about the spinal cord and also all the cranial nerves. Okay, so let's start with what our brain looks like. So this part of the brain, this big part of the brain, is called the cerebrum. And then this part of the brain is called the cerebellum. Cerebellum means small brain. And then also down here, you see the spinal cord. So we can divide our brain, and technically each hemisphere, into 4 lobes. So in the front, you have the frontal lobe. In the back, you have the occipital lobe. On the lateral side of the brain, so on the side, you have the temporal lobe. And above that, so more dorsal to that, you have the parietal lobe. So grossly, these lobes all have different functions. However, they always work together as an interactive system. And do you see all these little folds right here? So we're going to talk about those in more detail later. But all these little folds are neatly organized, and each little ridge, so each little part like this, has a specific name and also a specific function. Okay, so the brain has 3 types of brain matter. We have gray matter, we have white matter, and reticular matter. So gray matter is mainly on the outside layers of the brain, and this is also called the cortex. And some structures in the middle of the brain are also gray matter too. We'll talk about this later. So gray matter consists mainly of blood vessels and neuronal cell bodies. So I need you to remember this. And white matter is mainly on the inside of the brain and consists of the axons of those neuronal cell bodies that are found in gray matter. So the white matter is white because it actually has a fat substance or a fatty substance around the axons, and this is what we call myelin. And myelin is a substance that makes sure that our information processing speeds up. So for example, in this picture, you can see the gray matter neatly on the outside, right here, and then on the inside you see the white matter. So remember, the white matter is whiter than the gray matter because it has more fat in it. So if you would zoom in, so that obviously this is a schematic picture. So gray matter has all the cell bodies and also little dendrites and also blood vessels. And the white matter mainly has these axons. So this is one neuron, but the axons are in the white matter and the cell bodies are in the gray matter. So again, the reason the white matter is white is because of this fatty substance, and in here you see it in purple. So this is the myelin. So myelin wraps around these axons and makes the information processing go faster. But we will talk about this in more details later on in the class. Okay, so here you see one hemisphere of a monkey brain. So on the left side you see that this brain is stained with a Nissl stain, and the Nissl stain mainly stains the cell bodies. So wherever you see darker purple, that is gray matter. So right here you see all the beautiful gray matter in the different layers. And you see that the white matter here is way lighter. So that is because there are not as many cell bodies, or there's no cell bodies in the white matter. On the right side, you see another slice of the monkey brain, and here it is stained with a fiber stain. So here the white matter has the stain, so the white matter is darker, and the gray matter is lighter. Okay, so let's go over some terms. So I definitely need you to know what ventricles, nuclei, nerves, and tracts are before we go further into the lectures. So ventricles are hollow cavities within our brain, and they are filled with CSF. So in the next picture, I think I have a picture of it, so I'll talk a little bit more about that then. But remember, they're hollow pockets or cavities filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Then layers or nuclei are a group of cell bodies that are tightly packed together. So in the central nervous system, they are called nuclei, but in the peripheral nervous system, they are called ganglia. So remember the difference between nuclei and ganglia. So nuclei are in the CNS and ganglia are in the PNS. So these are groups of cell bodies. And then tracts are large collections of axons projecting to or away from the central nervous system. So if they're inside of the nervous system, they're called tracts. And whenever they go outside of the nervous system, they're called nerves. So an example of a tract is the corticospinal tract or the optic tract. So nerves are technically the same thing as tracts. These are fiber pathways that enter and leave the CNS, and they are outside of the central nervous system. So they are in the peripheral nervous system. So examples of these are the auditory nerve or the vagus nerve. Okay, so here you see our ventricles in our brain in blue in these pictures. So remember, ventricles are pockets inside of our brain that are filled with CSF. So we have 4 ventricles in our brain, and they're all interconnected. So right here you see the lateral ventricle. We have 2 of those. So we have one in the left hemisphere and we have one in the right hemisphere. So then these lateral, so the left and right lateral ventricles, they will connect to the 3rd ventricle right here. This is in the middle of the brain, so this is technically between the 2 hemispheres. And then through this little aqueduct, or through this little pipe right here, which we call the cerebral aqueduct, the 3rd ventricle connects to the 4th ventricle. And the 4th ventricle is located here by the brainstem. So here you see a different view, so a coronal view. So here you have the lateral ventricles, here too. Then these are connected to the 3rd ventricle in the middle. And then through the cerebral aqueduct, it is connected to the 4th ventricle, which is in the brainstem. Okay, so then our brainstem eventually goes on downwards, and then it turns into our spinal cord. So our spinal cord lies inside of the bony spinal column, which are a series of vertebrae that are organized in 5 anatomical regions from our neck all the way to our bottom. So the top region right here, so the top region is called the cervical region. Then we have the thoracic region, then the lumbar region, and lastly the sacral region, and a tiny part here is the coccygeal segment or region. So each of these segments have their corresponding nerves, except for the coccygeal segment at the bottom. Each body segment forms a ring, which we call a dermatome, and that encircles the spinal column. So you can see that in the body right here. So a dermatome would, for example, be here the C7, or you would see the T9 right here. So this pattern originated when men would walk on arms and legs, or with their arms also for walking. So if you imagine the person in this drawing to stand on all fours, you can see how this pattern technically makes sense. So each of these spinal segments, they connect to somatic spinal nerve fibers to the dermatome with the same number, including all the organs and all the muscles that lie within it. So all the nerves in the nervous system in the spinal cord, for example, let's say T7, they will produce all the sensations. They will take all the sensations from this little layer and send it to the brain. Or if the brain sends information to move these muscles, then this is the dermatome for this section of the spinal cord. Okay, so if we would cut open our spinal cord and take a little slice out, this is technically what you would see. So here you have the spinal cord. If you would cut it open and take this slice out, this is what you would see. So the outer side of the spinal cord consists of tracts and fibers, and therefore the white matter is on the outside. And the inside contains mainly the cell bodies, and therefore the gray matter is on the inside. So as you can see, it's technically flipped with the brain. With the brain, the gray matter is on the outside and the white matter is on the inside. So the gray matter within the spinal cord has the shape of a butterfly. So the top part of the butterfly wings is what we call the dorsal horns. You can see those right here, dorsal horn. Here's another dorsal horn. And the bottom part of the butterfly wings are the ventral horns. So here you see one ventral horn and another ventral horn. So the anterior half of the spinal cord is important for motor information, so being able to move your muscle. So that is all, this part is important for motor movement. And then this part is important for sensory information. So for example, touch or temperature or heat. So sensory information is afferent, it goes towards the brain, and motor information is efferent, it goes away from the brain. Okay, so the horns are the gray matter that are here on the inside. And then the roots are when the information goes outside of the spinal cord. So I have a picture of that. So what I want you to remember is the dorsal horn is the gray matter, which has all the sensory information. So right here. And the ventral horn is the gray matter for motor information. And then the dorsal root contains a strand of afferent fibers with sensory information. So this goes to the brain. And then the ventral root is a strand of efferent fibers with motor information. So let me show you a picture of that. Okay, so here you have a picture, a schematic picture of the spinal cord with information going in and information going out. So first, sensory information can come in right here. And then here you see the posterior root. So fibers entering into the posterior root bring sensory information from sensory receptors. For example, from your skin or from your hands. And then some of this information will go up. It will go to either other segments of the spinal cord or all the way to the brain. And some of it connects to the front, to where the motor neurons start. And some of it crosses over to the other side. So collateral branches of sensory information may cross to the other side and influence motor neurons here. So then here, the white matter fiber tracts that are outside of the gray matter carry information to and from the brain. So if it goes to the brain, it's most likely the sensory information, and if it goes away from the brain, it's most likely the motor information. And then fibers here that leave the anterior root, so here you have the anterior root, they carry information to the muscles. So they will tell your muscles to move. Okay, so people who have had accidents where they got lesions below their cervical segments often no longer have control over their legs. So this happens whenever you have an injury between your T1 and your L5. So you have your T1 and your L5 goes all the way to here. So if you have an injury between here And here, there is a likelihood that you will not have any control over your legs. If the cut is higher, however, there is a possibility that the patient won't be able to move their arms as well. So if the cut is between C1 or C8, the person might also not have control over the legs and arms. Okay, so connections between the segments of our spinal cord, they organize more complex movements that require multiple segments to work together. So an example of that is, for example, when you withdraw your leg when you step on something painful, something pointy or spiky. But when you step your leg away, your right leg away, for example, your other leg needs to extend at the same time so it can support your body. So this is one of those more complex actions that your spinal cord is capable of organizing. Then we also have reflexes. Reflexes are movements that depend solely on your spinal cord. So among the many kinds of sensory receptors in the bodies, we have receptors for pain, temperature, touch, pressure, and sensations of muscle and joint movements. So stimulation of, for example, pain and temperature will make your limb flex, and stimulation of fine touch will make your limb extend. So this makes sense, right? So, for example, when you touch a hot pan by accident, you're cooking and you accidentally touch it, the pain and temperature will make your arm flex away from the pan. So you're avoiding to stay in trouble. Okay, the last couple slides are going to be about the cranial nerves. So we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Our cranial nerves convey sensory and motor signals to and from the head. So one set of cranial nerves controls the left hemisphere and the other set controls the contralateral hemisphere. So cranial nerves can have afferent functions, as for sensory inputs to the brain from the eyes or from the mouth or nose or ears. Or they can have efferent functions for things like movements of the facial muscles, or if you want to stick out your tongue, or if you want to roll your eyes. So cranial nerves with sensory information connect with the posterior part of the brainstem, and cranial nerves with motor information connect to the anterior part of the brainstem. So that sounds familiar, right? Because that's exactly the same way how it happens in the spinal cord. So some cranial nerves have only sensory information, some only have motor information or functions, and some have both. So they have both sensory and motor functions. Some of the cranial nerves even control various internal organs, such as your heart or your gut. So here you have a picture of all the cranial nerves. We'll go over those in more detail in a couple of slides. So here you have the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So the first one is the olfactory, which is the cranial nerve important for smell. So this is a sensory cranial nerve. The second one is optic, which is important for vision, and it is sensory. The third one is oculomotor, which is important for eye movement, and it is a motor nerve. Then we have the trochlear cranial nerve, which is also important for eye movement and is a motor nerve. The fifth one is a trigeminal nerve, which is important for masticatory movements, which is both sensory and motor. Then we have the abducens nerve, which is also important for eye movement. You need a lot of nerves to move your eyes. Then the seventh one is the facial nerve, which is important for facial movements. So if you want to frown or smile. This one is both sensory and motor. Number 8 is the auditory vestibular, which is important for hearing, and this one is sensory. Then we have number 9, which is the glossopharyngeal, and this one is important for your tongue and pharynx. This one is both sensory and motor. Then my favorite one is the vagus nerve. This one is important for controlling your heart rate, your blood vessels, your viscera, movement of your larynx and pharynx, and it is both sensory and motor. The 11th one is the spinal accessory. It's important for neck muscles and your viscera, and it is motor. And then the last one is the hypoglossal. So this one is for your tongue muscles, and this one is also motor. So I know if this is the first time you hear all these words, it is a lot to take in. So I would highly recommend printing it out and just like sticking it somewhere on your desk or where you see it often, because eventually later on in the semester we will have to know all these cranial nerves. So here you see them on the ventral side of the brain. So here's the brainstem, here's the cerebellum, here's the cerebrum, and here you can see all of them organized by their numbers. So this one's important for smell, this one's important for vision, you give a bunch for eye movement, these are for masticatory movements, etc. So these are all organized by their number, and here I put all their functions here as well. So this is the end of this video, and I will see you guys back soon.